Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Craig Lipset, a recognized leader at the forefront of research and medical development, the former head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, where he launched the first fully remote and virtual clinical trial for a new medicine. People can join when they join on.
Great. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first New York Bio Breakfast Series virtual edition. We have thoroughly enjoyed doing these conversations over the years, and we generally do them at a rate of about one every 2 months. However, given everything that's going on, we decided it's pretty easy. We don't have to order breakfast. You bring your own coffee, and we'll get going with a once a week virtual series. And we're very excited that Craig Lipset is here to help kick off our virtual series. I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce himself in just a few minutes. A little housekeeping, and somewhat bear with us. This is our first time that we're doing the virtual webinar. In the bottom of your screen, you'll see there is a chat button, and there you can send a message to the different panelists so that we can see it. But there's also a Q&A button. And if you have a question during our conversation today, submit it in the Q&A button, and we'll be able to see it and respond to it. Because this is a Zoom webinar, it's not like a Zoom chat where you see everyone. You all just will see us, and we will be able to view your questions through Q&A. Okay, I feel like I'm doing the exits or this way. or I'm my Peloton instructor, and I'm like, if you turn the knob to the right, it makes it harder, and you go up your hill. If you turn it to the left, you reduce your resistance, and we go downhill. But just a few notes from the New York Bio files. Obviously, as many of you are aware, we needed to postpone our March 10th annual meeting, in which Craig is going to be a panelist, and we have rescheduled it. The good news is we have rescheduled it for September 14th, and granted, we will all do our best to make sure that hopefully we can have the meeting in person, and it looks relatively similar to what we expect a New York Bio meeting to do. Certainly we'll obviously be following the governor and other healthcare guidelines as we look forward to our meeting in September. Before then, though, we obviously are having our series once a week. We're going to have Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. coffee with different speakers each week. And then one other thing, and I'll send the invite out to all of the attendees on tomorrow. The days do tend to run together. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., the New York Stock Exchange has been having a series of conversations with business and healthcare leaders over the past few weeks. And I reached out to them a couple of weeks ago and asked if they would have Jim Greenwood, who is the president and CEO of BIO, the National Bio Organization, as one of their guests, and they are. So they're going to have a conversation with Jim tomorrow at 11. That invite just came out yesterday, so I will forward it to you all if you're able to join. We have a nice partnership with the New York Stock Exchange as they try to also support emerging biotech companies. And our next emerging biotech showcase, originally scheduled for May 11th, has been postponed, and our new date is June 29th. I think I got that right, Derek, didn't I? And then, so we'll be featuring a series of emerging New York biotech companies down at the New York Stock Exchange that day, assuming that we can actually have an in-person gathering then. I think those were the main things I wanted to do in addition to our housekeeping, but the main thing is welcome you to our conversation today and to welcome Craig. So Derek is going to do a moderated chat with Craig next, but Craig, I'm going to flip it to you to give an introduction of yourself. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. You definitely have a second career as a flight attendant. Job well done. It's good to be here virtually with everybody. I hope folks on the line are all safe and well. My name is Craig Lipset. I was the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, so I looked after innovation across our medicine development portfolio, across therapeutic areas, across geographies, and that included all of our work with digital, our strategies for patient engagement, our collaborations and consortia in the field. Since last summer, I've had my own growth advisory. I'm working with different pharma and biotech on their enterprise strategies for innovation and medicine development, as well as with technology and startups and the venture community that are all looking at new solutions to improve and accelerate how we develop medicines. It's great to be here with you all this morning.
All right, well, let's jump in. I think anybody that's followed, any of the real world evidence or data presentations over the last little bit is generally familiar with you, Craig. And I thought one of the great ways to kick off might be to talk a little bit more about patient engagement, especially from the standpoint of either a large biopharma company or even a smaller company, and maybe just start with maybe some of the best practices that you've seen across the industry for how people engage with patients either inside a clinical trial or outside of a clinical trial environment.
It's a great question, and it's very topical. And I think what's reassuring here is this is more than just rhetoric today. And I should mention, I don't just support folks in the industry. I'm drinking from my Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research mug right now. I'm on the board there, and certainly do what I can to help support their work in the field. I think that we've seen this evolution that started in the rare disease space. It started with many that were developing in oncology as well, where these drug development teams were engaging very actively and proactively with advocacy groups and with patient groups. Historically, that was a step change. Historically, drug development teams went to advocacy groups when they were struggling to recruit patients into their trials. And the advocacy groups tried to be helpful, but they usually felt this was too late in the process. They wanted to be engaged earlier as partners. And certainly we saw that starting to happen over the last few years, again, starting in rare and in oncology. And I think that was almost version 0.1. That was like our beta of patient engagement in medicine development. Over the last few years, we've seen that start to expand across therapeutic areas and across portfolios. When I left Pfizer, we had instantiated that any protocol that was going to our protocol review committee would be challenged with two questions. What input did you get from patients, and how did this affect the design of your study? And that was meant to be across all therapeutic areas, because we had seen that there was the potential for this impact in the operational feasibility of our studies, as well as making sure that we're choosing the right endpoints. And so I think today, inside of many large pharma companies, there's a very substantial commitment to partnering with advocacy groups from early stages, and certainly many in the biotech community and in the smaller biopharma space fully embrace that as well. I've seen some young companies that have very few resources, but yet still commit substantial energy at times from their executive leadership, and then trickling down into the lines in terms of building and maintaining those relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this. A lot of our audience and a lot of our kind of fellows members within New York Bio are discovery stage companies that may either have a lead candidate molecule or even a handful of targets that they're starting with. And are there any angles? How early is there too early? Is it possible to engage with patients too early? How do you do things like that on that early side of the equation?
There are different spaces where advocacy groups have different levels of maturity, and certainly many of them pick up more when molecules are hitting the clinic. Many of the advocacy groups are really well positioned to help in terms of that engagement with physician key opinion leaders, and helping to organize patients through registries, helping teams to consider different endpoints that may be most meaningful. But there are certainly some that work much earlier in the process. And so it may vary a little bit by the disease area, how engaged a patient advocacy group might be as a partner to an early stage company that's still in the discovery stage. There's certainly some that are more sophisticated when it comes to helping to maintain libraries of different targets, helping to maintain networks and connectivity to help connect interested researchers with different companies. And then certainly there's the wide world of venture philanthropy, and what role the philanthropic community can play in helping to support early stage companies at the discovery stage.
That's excellent. So I think we can also think about where we sit in in the world now. So how does COVID-19 affect all of this? How are people dealing with this in the face of the quote unquote new reality?
I'd say clinical trials today are falling in a few different compartments. And the first that I'll touch on, Derek, are the studies that are not in COVID-19 related indications. Because up until a month ago, there was a global portfolio of new medicines that were in development across therapeutic areas. As we've seen in the different headlines, most studies that were enrolling have paused enrollment, and many planned new study starts have also been paused. And so there is this grand pause taking place. Some large companies have indicated this is enterprise-wide. Some others have suggested there may be geographical pockets out there where they can reopen studies or where they can reopen enrollment. But there's also an entire portfolio of trials that were ongoing at the time of this pandemic escalating in the US and around the world. And so for many of those studies, the key concern has been, I've got patients who are on an investigational medicine. Many of them are relying on access to that medicine. How can I keep these patients on the medicine? How can I keep the study from having to terminate early? They're really
And not only that, but I imagine, COVID as either a comorbidity or a confounding factor could step in too.
Absolutely. Once you have your first patient in the hospital who ends up in your study, who ends up diagnosed with COVID, all of a sudden, everything's going to go out the window in terms of concerns around adverse events and reporting around this. But these three big concerns that I think are paramount right now are, can I keep my patient on drug? In other words, can I manage the supply chain, which used to go through the clinic? Can I manage it getting all the way through to the patient in their home? The second, can I monitor those patients for safety and fulfill my responsibilities from GCP and for ethical and clinical purposes? And finally, can I capture my endpoint data? Can I monitor these patients and collect the data around efficacy and safety, which was the reason I was doing the study in the first place? And if there are any of those three that I can't do, this trial is probably going to end early, end in futility. So we're seeing a lot of different levers being pulled, a lot of countermeasures being deployed, whether it's home health professionals, the ability to deliver drug directly to patients in the home, the ability to support home infusions, the ability to remotely monitor the safety of patients, as well as the ability to use video and other means to try to maintain our ability of capturing endpoint data, continuing to measure what's happening in those studies.
Yeah, I imagine the benefits here bend towards the people that were really ensconced in greater technology and kind of if not preparing for this, or at least had really kind of dove into how they were engaging with patients and how they were staying connected. And even if they hadn't pulled the trigger on some of these platforms earlier, at least they understood how they could affect what they were doing, so they could be quick, they could be nimble, and they could institute them when they had to.
Derek, it's such a great point. None of the countermeasures I mentioned had to be invented at the time of the pandemic. They were all available. They were all on the bench for many organizations. Some had incorporated them into their studies, maybe as countermeasures to improve experience and access for patients, trying to use visiting nurses in the home to make life easier for their research participants. Some had been more forward-leaning around the endpoints that they would like to use for their studies, leaning towards more progressive and innovative endpoints that could be captured outside of a clinical setting. And certainly organizations that had incorporated some of those approaches in their studies were that much better prepared for this type of an event. Not that they'd use these countermeasures anticipating a pandemic. Maybe they use these countermeasures just to improve access and convenience and representative patient participation in their trials. But as you indicate, they're better positioned than some of their peers. And I think looking at the endpoints of studies is probably the best way to sort of see how well prepared a study was for what's happening today. So many of the endpoints that we rely on, Derek, are antiquated. They're so fragile that we have to have the patient come back and forth into the clinic, maybe just to watch them walk back and forth for 6 minutes, because the endpoint is so fragile that we can't capture it outside of the home. But many of the technologists on your call and in your organization know that there are probably apps out there that we could have been using all along to capture a 6-minute walk test or capture other endpoint data with the same or greater confidence. But you can't throw that into your study when a pandemic hits. It's you needed to plan for that a year or 18 months ago.
If the endpoint of the study is they need to fill out a form that's on paper, and that's the only form that they can fill out, you're kind of stuck if they can't get the form.
You know, it's a lot of scrambling right now to try to figure out where are there digital tools we can quickly insert to keep some of those measurements happening. And in other cases, it may mean we're accumulating missing data, and there's only so much missing data you can tolerate before you end up saying this study is just futile at this stage.
Yeah. What do you got, Jennifer?
One question is, do you think that this will allow or drive study sponsors to try and incorporate these types of things as initial, right, going forward? And then B, do you think that there is any push toward a geographic distribution that will be more broad? Because what we've seen certainly with COVID-19 is there are certain parts of the country that are hit much harder. Now, granted, they're they're population centers, right, which are going to be where we find more of our maybe trial participants. But is that going to be a factor in the design going forward?
You know, Jennifer, it's a great question. And for a while, I was looking at this space and feeling like, you know, are the organizations or the research sponsors going to commit to the change? And, you know, these types of countermeasures I was describing that people are standing up are being treated mostly as protocol deviations and SOP waivers. And words like deviation and waiver imply that we're going to come back to our old ways. These are just temporary drifts that we need to accommodate. But as we look at the reality of COVID-19, and that maybe some businesses will start to reopen soon, but they're not going to reopen in earnest until there is a vaccine. Chronic disease patients with chronic diseases will not be venturing out and wandering in and out of hospitals for optional study visits until there's a vaccine. And so these approaches, I agree, are going to have to become the new normal faster than we probably would have thought. Because if you have a new study that you want to start later this year, you have to incorporate the reality that there can be a second wave of COVID-19. You have to incorporate the reality that your patients with chronic diseases are not going to be enthused to go in and out of hospitals for optional visits just to watch a patient walk or capture other data. And so to me, I think these are going to have to move up the chain quickly from being secondary countermeasures that we want to have ready to deploy in case there's another emergency and we have to break the glass. And they're going to have to move into the first line, because if you want to get a study started in the next 18 months, you have to incorporate these tools or you have no confidence that this will continue.
You know, from the way that you described that, you now have kind of it's not a participation barrier, but kind of the energy for a patient to really participate in a study. They have to really want to do it. And you have to be engaged with them enough to have mind share enough that they're going to do the things that you ask them to. And there's probably a higher bar for just the baseline of being willing to participate now. There's a couple of really good questions here, and I'll adapt the first one from Kevin, who said, you know, what are some of the real challenges to having productive discussions with patients, both in discovery and preclinical stages? And I would say now, you know, what are really some of the big barriers that are erected here that kind of stand in the way of effective communication for either large or small companies?
I think that many organizations had this perception that there was a legal barrier that prevented them from engaging directly with patients. And maybe that's, you know, a mindset out of commercial, although many commercial organizations are engaging with their customers all the time. They have processes to know how to do that. I think that in the research and development side, there are known guardrails. There are publications from groups like the National Health Council, which is a umbrella organization of advocacy groups that helps to describe those guardrails. There are publications from CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, CTTI, which is a public-private partnership with the FDA run out of Duke, which has also published guidelines and recommendations for engaging with advocacy groups, and continued on to try to quantify some of the ROI of doing so in terms of reducing the number of protocol amendments, which have a very known cost attached. I think that there are, aside from sort of the perceived legal barriers that are out there, which can easily be demystified with data around the processes that are available, I think then there are some cultural concerns that people may have. What if they tell me to do something in my study that I can't do? Am I going to disappoint these patients that I'm convening if they ask me to make a change in my target that I've prioritized or in the endpoint that I'm selecting? Am I just setting people up for disappointment? And I think that if we frame these conversations correctly, that doesn't seem to happen. When we set these conversations up to be informed and bi-directional, I've seen very positive outcomes. There was one example that jumps to my mind of a medical dermatology study that we had where there was going to be a washout period because that was clinically and scientifically appropriate to have. And when the study team, and this wasn't in a rare disease indication, it wasn't in oncology, but when the study team was sitting with the patients, it took 1, 2, 3 different cycles together. And the message from the patients got through: we can't tolerate having a washout period of the length that you're describing. It's insufferable. And so the study team adapted their protocol around that. And it probably saved them an amendment in the process, right, by having inadequate enrollment downstream. But I think, you know, going back to culture, I think there was a really positive byproduct there for both sides in terms of the sentiment of engagement and really trying to listen to one another.
With kind of now the value on people's engagement within the trial, do you see a move towards people experimenting more with either virtual or synthetic clinical trial arms?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So at Transcelerate, at Pfizer years ago, we had started doing some work around synthetic control arms and placebo data reuse. And so the initial concept there for us was we have control arm data that we could potentially reuse across different studies that we had already completed. And we started to roll that into a large consortia that the pharma companies, the large pharma, had called Transcelerate. And Transcelerate is it's a nonprofit organization whose members include 19 of the top 20 pharma companies, and they had launched an initiative to share their placebo and standard of care data and try to make more reuse of that. Then we started to see some other organizations here in New York, groups like Medidata, that helped to take a look across the data that they've been collecting across different studies and say, can we make additional reuse of these control arms? I think that to date, the FDA has been receptive, but in general, the regulators aren't necessarily looking for that in registration studies. I think the signal has been for earlier stage research, pharma companies can learn and biotech companies can learn around this. And what I think is great about the whole synthetic control arm space is you can validate that in your phase 2 environment with very little risk. Run your phase 2 study with a control arm and have a third arm that's completely synthetic and data derived. And in your phase 2 setting, you can start to build the experience and start to build the data set that can substantiate your ability to use more synthetic controls in later stages. I think it'll be some time before we see a fully synthetic control arm in a registration study. Maybe we'll see that in rare diseases or certain device studies, but the ability just to reduce the 1-to-1 ratio of active to control and enable patients to have access, more opportunity to getting the investigational medicine that they really were looking for when they joined. Also call out that there are some really cool movements to take a more, a sort of even more contemporary spin on this. There's one company out of the Bay Area that is generating digital twins of the active patients in the study. And so taking this approach of, can I enroll in my active arm, create a digital twin of the patients who are in the active arm, and synthesize a control arm based off of the patients in the active. My own digital twin is my control, and where they're modeling out how my digital twin would be responding if they were not introduced to the new medicine.
That's a really interesting concept.
Can I get a digital twin?
We have
housework?
one.
Well, Jennifer, it's a great question. It's funny. Like, as a flight attendant, Jennifer, you would know that digital twins have existed for jet engines and large machinery for years. I mean, that's how manufacturers monitor everything that's going on. They strap so many sensors on a piece of hardware that they can monitor it centrally. But it's funny you mentioned that about your digital twin. I wrote a piece on LinkedIn about a year and a half ago, or a year now, wondering if my digital twin was going to enroll in a clinical trial without me.
Right,
because
yeah.
I have so much data about me that's kind of floating around out there, right? That different people can buy and have access to and synthesize digital me's. And the rules today don't necessarily require that my digital me got my physical me's permission and consent before it was used in someone else's research study. And so, Jennifer, you may have a digital twin. Your digital twin may be out there in a clinical research study right now. Personally, I don't think that's a very sustainable model for research. I think that we're going to have to rein in a little of our digital twins.
Mm-hmm.
I would watch this show on Amazon Prime right now. I genuinely, I think we can do this. I don't know, NewYorkBIO has never really delved into the actual creative content or film industry, but this might be something that we can explore. So we have another good question here asking about the kind of the areas of the clinical trial tech stack, if you will, and any of the kind of new technologies or startups that you've seen that are really at the forefront of this. Who are the people that are really kind of pushing the envelope on this stuff?
No, it's a great question. So, the traditional clinical trial tech stack all revolved around electronic data capture, which was basically the 20th century modernization of paper case report forms. So instead of having case report forms where an investigator would sit with a pen and fill out a form, these were done on the internet with a web form. And we would call that system electronic data capture. And it's still very investigator dependent. In today's world, you could imagine that the ability to have an investigator interacting in person with a patient and entering information into a web form is going to be a little constrained right now. We can't rely on patients showing up at a clinic in order to have that type of an interaction. Enter, I think, more opportunity for electronic diaries, electronic patient-reported outcomes, electronic clinical outcome assessments that can be adjudicated centrally over the web. I think we're going to see the proliferation of a lot of these other data sources. Those data sources can be either self-reported with a patient interacting, or they can be self-tracked with different types of thoughtfully used sensors and wearables to support data capture. We can often still get a lot of our diagnostic data, though, whether that's through different specimens that can be collected in the home with a home health professional or otherwise. But I think that our ability to rely on electronic data capture as we have to date is having a lesser impact than the rise of some of these other data capture technologies. Now, the second half of that question was, is this a place for young companies? Are we seeing the rise of the startups around some of these challenge areas? Now, there is an interesting ecosystem of young companies, venture-backed companies that have been focusing on in-home clinical trials and in-home participation. I think that they're certainly busy right now. There's some innovative companies that have taken like a gig economy approach to home health professionals. I think they're certainly very busy right now. The electronic diary space has been a challenging one. There are 2 or 3 very large private equity backed incumbents that have done a lot of acquisitions in this space. And because of because of that private equity consumption of companies once they reach a certain revenue threshold, the environment in that field is kind of like there's two large incumbents, a very wide gap with very few players, and then a long tail of younger growth companies in that space. So it's a almost like an unusual bimodal distribution of partners out there. This long tail of growth companies, this almost gap of mid-sized companies, because so many of them have been consumed by these larger private equity-backed incumbents.
Excellent. Sorry, I was just answering another question by typing it out. So, are there any areas in? I had looked at a couple of these. Are there any areas in either home collection or thinking about how to bring measurements in clinical trials into the home that we kind of still aren't there yet, or where are the places that we're genuinely good at, or that we aren't? I had looked previously at a couple of companies that did kind of the needle-free blood draw. 7 Sense was one of them, and there was a GE one as well. And how good are we at kind of sending stuff to your kitchen and having it come back with some piece of you for clinical trial?
So, I would open by just noting that I don't believe the future of clinical research is entirely sightless, virtual, and in the home. And this is coming from the guy who did one of the first fully remote virtual trials in the pharmaceutical industry. 10 years ago, I helped to architect the Pfizer remote trial, which was the first done entirely in-home under an IND. But when we look at physician ratings on sites like Health Grades, the average physician rating in this country is a 4.4 out of 5. Patients like their doctors in their lives. Post on Facebook later today that you're looking for a new cardiologist. Watch all your friends jump in and say, you should see mine, she's the best. Very rarely do people then come in and say, don't see this guy. They will, don't get me wrong, but people tend to be pretty energized about their doctor in their life. And so to me, the future for research participation should be one of choice and location flexibility. We should be incorporating ways that use technology and other innovations that can improve access, enable more patients to participate, those who aren't able to get to an elite research site or can't get there during the day, and open more doors without closing others. So with that being said, I think that bringing home health professionals into the home is not a failure if we're not able to get the draw that we need, if we can't get it timed the way we need it to for, say, a population PK sample that needs to be drawn. These are okay alternatives to bring in. There are still circumstances where dosing in the home is scary. Dose escalation studies for early phase 1 types of molecules or phase 1b types of situations, those can be certainly very intimidating when we have concerns about immunogenicity or anaphylaxis, and wanting to make sure we have the right controls around us certainly makes a lot of sense. But those are not the majority of the clinical trials that are taking place on clinicaltrials.gov today. Those are not the majority of the clinical trials that are running inside of the biopharmaceutical industry today. I think that, Derek, the rate limiter to me will probably continue to be one dimension around the safety of the molecule and how much we know about it, and the other being our ability to invest in measurement and endpoints that allow us to be location flexible in how we capture our data. I keep going back to it, but the idea that we would make people go out in this environment to watch them walk for 6 minutes is just plain nonsensical.
Yeah. Well, there's a good segue there on sensors and validation and things. So we had talked about this a little bit yesterday, but when we think about the advancement of sensors, like even the one in the Apple Watch, right? It's not really considered a medical grade sensor, but it has the ability to reach millions and millions of people. So we're entering a realm where we have the potential to get lots and lots of data that, quite honestly, might not be very good. And how do we square that away with how we're either thinking about that from a medical standpoint, or, perhaps, more dangerously? How do we square that away from, in terms of the people that are thinking of these things in terms of artificial intelligence, right? Are we basically building up a system that can give a lot of bad data to algorithms that can tell us what to do with it?
And drives behavior too, right? It doesn't just give
Absolutely.
information. Like
Absolutely.
if I don't do my stand, right? I mean, like it drives behavior.
So, I think there are at least three different questions in that conversation there.
Yeah, sorry.
The first to me is, what do we use to measure in our studies? And while it's easy to go to Best Buy and grab, something that's really cool and says it can measure steps, we still need to have confidence that what it's measuring is qualified as an endpoint in a research study. Now, that doesn't mean that FDA approval means that it's qualified or that it isn't qualified. The qualification needs to be tethered to what it is that we're measuring in a given study. Am I measuring, somebody's 6-minute walk test? I'll keep falling back to that example. Requires us to use devices and algorithms that have been qualified for that purpose, that we have invested in the additional studies that let us know that in this patient population, these digital tools answer the question the way that we need it to. Now, it might mean that an Apple Watch can work for you, but you can't just grab it off the shelf and introduce it in your study. You still need to incorporate that precursor step of testing out that device in your patient population to qualify that you can get the measurement out of it that you're looking for. Now, Jennifer raised a very important point here, which is many of your consumer devices, the elegance of the device is that it's representing data and information back to the patient to try to influence their behavior. If you're incorporating that in your study, to me, you're now incorporating another intervention in your study. If you believe that a Fitbit or an Apple Watch is going to improve people's health because they're managing this device with the data that's being represented, well, that's now another health intervention you've just introduced into your clinical trial along with your investigational drug. Maybe that's intentional, but it shouldn't be unintentional, right? So maybe you're looking at it and saying, actually, I want to study the combination of maybe my this digital tool is synergistic as a digital therapeutic alongside with my new drug. That's probably not what early stage drug developers had in mind, though. And so we really have to be cognizant about, in particular with the consumer devices, how much information is going to be shared with a patient while they're in the research study, and do you have flexibility around that? For every cool consumer device, there's probably a research grade device that isn't quite as sexy and pretty, but can capture equivalent data. I think it's important for researchers to take note of the options that are available there. The Digital Medicine Society, DIME, has been building a catalog of different digital devices and helping organizations to have access to what devices are out there and some of the data around it. And then there are some other groups out there like Electra Labs that are building additional repositories around those different devices and sensors that go a click deeper, actually, Derek, into this other question that you were raising around the safety and security of those devices. Certainly these devices will capture a wealth of data, and we need to, as researchers, know what the diversity of data is, how that data is being managed and stored, the security around that data, and we need to be able to communicate that effectively to the research participants in a fully transparent way during the consenting process. We shouldn't be putting a device on a patient in one of our research studies without us and them being fully aware of where that data is going to go and how much data we're collecting.
Is there any benefit? Am I unmuted? Okay, good. I'm unmuted. Is there any benefit to having data both reported back to the patient during a trial as well as obviously to the sponsor? But is there a reason for some data to go to the patient unless you're trying to influence a certain behavior?
I did a lot of work in this area when I was at Pfizer, and we did the first studies that we were returning summaries of study results to patients at study end. And then I did the first where we were returning individuals' own health data back to them at the study end. And at the time we were using the federal standard, the blue button. And for those that know Pfizer, you'll get a kick out of the fact that I had people that would stop me in the Pfizer headquarters building and say, Craig, that was really clever branding your project the blue button because, you know, obviously it matches our logo. But I did not brand it the blue button. That was done, you know, by CMS and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. That was obviously bigger than Pfizer. To your point, it makes a ton of sense for patients to have access to their health data from the studies in which they participate. We see the new open data rules that HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, just announced a month ago, that with new APIs that will be emerging for all of us as consumers to not only see fragments and scraps of data through patient portals, but now to have the APIs to fully access all of our diverse health data in different institutions. And yet, research data still often lives in its own little silo. And all too often, a patient may be participating in a research study and getting a needle stick and a blood draw that may involve a chemistry panel, but it's living in a siloed data set from the rest of that patient's care team. They may have to next week go get another blood draw, pay out of pocket a copay to support that, to generate data that was just generated the week earlier, but not being adequately shared. Now, there's always data in a clinical research study, or most times, that needs to be blinded, that we don't want patients or investigators to see for fear that it will impact their perception around which treatment assignment they're on or otherwise change their behaviors. Traditionally, we've thought about blinding around the investigators. We don't want them to see certain things. We do want them to see others. And quite honestly, we just treated the whole patient as blinded. You're not seeing anything because traditionally, patients didn't see any of their own data. The research community has not kept pace with now starting to rethink blinding and how much of the study data the actual participant needs to be blinded to and how much they can have visibility to while they're in the trial. Is your patient in your trial blinded to their routine chemistry? Are they blinded to other data that's being collected and why? Or are they effectively meant to be blinded to the same slices of data as the investigator, and that the rest of it we can make available? Now, it's not as easy as it should be. There have really only been about 3 research sponsors, 3 large pharma companies that have been able to return data back to patients, and it's mostly been at study end. J&J did some work returning data in study. In a couple of instances, it's not systematic right now. A number of companies have tried to work together in something they've coined the Patient Data Access Initiative, PDAI, to try to help drive more ability to share data back with the participants in research studies. But this is really early days. But the last thing I'll throw out around this, when you listen to patients, when you look at the answers from patients that they share about perceptions of research, they want access to their data. And with the open health APIs, they will be expecting access to their data.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Has this also come about, or is it, I guess, worked, maybe move forward because of the more open work with the patient advocacy foundations as well?
You know, as far as the expectations with the different advocacy groups and foundations in this space, you know, it's a fair question. I'm not sure. I don't think that any groups, even if a research foundation is sponsoring the study, I don't think anyone in the research community has really mastered data return. I think there are observational studies that do this pretty well. If you look at ResearchKit studies, if you look at the types of studies Evidation Health and others do, they're routinely making data available back through dashboards. They're doing that because that's the retention hook that they have, right? If you're in a drug trial, you're in it because you want access to a new medicine. If you're in an observational trial today, you're probably in it in part to get access to, you know, these types of dashboards and see how you're progressing over time. But it's really these interventional trials that still haven't figured this out. I'll tell you the direction that I think that if there's anyone out there, you know, an investor or technologist that wants to say, you know, well, how can I fix this? There's a lot of energy in the industry today around e-source, our ability to electronically source study data from electronic health records, so that when a patient is at NYU or some other medical center, instead of the provider typing it into Epic and then turning around and typing it into their electronic data capture system, these should be connected and we should be able to source our data electronically. E-source should be a two-way street, so that when we are collecting other study data from labs and other systems that's just siloed in our study database, once we have these connections of EHR and EDC, electronic health records and electronic data capture, we shouldn't just be sucking data out. We should be sharing study data back into the patient's record. And what's great about that is if we push our labs and other data back into the patient's record, the rest of their care team can see it. And again, thanks to those HHS open data rules, now the patient will see it too. Because once it's in their electronic health record at their provider through those same APIs, the patient will be able to get access to it.
This is great. And I just want to, I want to let our attendees know that I've actually been taking notes on a number of either the initiatives or the trials or anything that you've mentioned here. And what I'm going to do is after this today, I will both post on our LinkedIn page and through our Twitter feed some of the resources and some of the studies that you've mentioned. So if people aren't following us on there, they should. I'll post most of this and make it a little easier to find some of this stuff electronically, because we've delved into a few areas where there's guidance, where there's foundations, where there's initiatives that there's obviously more background on that the people can be aware of. So I think that's great. As kind of the ending point here, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and little bits of this have bubbled up through the discussion. But ultimately, one of the biggest things that comes to the forefront here is the element of trust between either patients and their doctors, patients and biopharma companies, because now we're talking about data and interventions and outcomes that have been generated from you, the patient, the participant, either in a clinical trial or in an intervention. And whether it's data that was taken from me off of an EHR, data that I've generated for a study, there has to be some level of trust that the people on the other side of that data are going to use it ethically, going to do the right thing with it, going to share it appropriately, etc. So what are some of the big things that you've seen in terms of really how people in industry are approaching that?
We have, if you look at most of the priorities of so many biopharma companies, large and small, so many of them will talk about precision medicine and data science on the one hand, patient engagement, patient centricity as buzzwords on the other. And to your point, Derek, I fear that these two are drifting apart from one another rather than drifting together. And one of the examples that comes to my mind is, we as researchers were voracious for data. And in many cases over the last few years, we've been very fortunate to be able to access patients' aggregated, de-identified electronic health data. And in some cases, we're using it to answer questions that requires access to tens of millions of lives. But many of the use cases that are perhaps the most exciting actually don't require us to have access to tens of millions of lives. It just requires us to have access to a smaller number of patients' lives, but the right patients. And an example that comes to my mind from last year, which I think generated, rightly so, a lot of great visibility, is the work that we had done at Pfizer to expand the label for Ibrance, which had been approved for breast cancer in men based on clinical trials that enrolled only women. And we were able to expand that label to include breast cancer in men based on real-world data and real-world evidence. And the approaches that we used were all legal, ethical, and appropriate at the time to be able to access patients' data to be able to answer this question. For companies that want to follow that model in 2020 and 2021, I would argue that you should not look to the past for how to do that, but look to the future. We accessed patients' electronic health data through different data partners, but in the years 2020 and 21, where we sit today, we don't have to go through data aggregators and data brokers to access patients' health data. We can ask. We can go to patients. We know how to find patients like these. We can find men with breast cancer who are on Ibrance, and we can use innovative data and innovative channels to be able to find them. But in today's world, we can then engage them and invite them to share their diverse health data with us to answer these research questions. We can include patients and engage them in the process. The power of doing that gives us the ability to capture much more diverse data than we otherwise might have. When we're actually engaging a patient in a transparent way, we can invite them to share biospecimens. We can invite them to share other outcomes data that may be of importance to us. The models of the past where patients are spending their hard-earned dollars on their healthcare, but yet other entities are able to walk off with their data out the back door unbeknownst to them, those are going to come to an end. They're simply unsustainable. I fear that otherwise there is a public backlash that we're going to be facing. There's a certain air of Henrietta Lacks in a digital era that's taking place, where even though the researchers, whether with HeLa cells or with digital health data, are well-intentioned and trying to answer the right questions, they're not doing it in a trusted and transparent way that respects the source. And I think where we sit today, we're at an inflection point where the tools are now available to us to embrace the new ways of engaging patients directly to make use of that data. So that to me is, I think, a very important tipping point.
You used a really important word there in the middle of your description. You're inviting patients to share things, right? It's an implicit recognition that the data that you're sharing is yours, and we invite you to allow that data into our study, or we invite you as researchers to allow us to use it. And that invitation carries with it. It carries kind of a modicum of trust. It carries a modicum of, we understand that you're giving us something of value and we want to use it in an ethical fashion. And, I think we're probably going to see a lot more people and a lot more companies, shift to really respecting that. There's a company in New York called Variant Bio that was started by Lux Capital that's going around the world and sequencing these diverse and remote populations, and has a post on Medium about the ethics of what they're doing and how they're basically signing contracts with every single village that they go to, talking about what they're going to do with their data, and at some point saying, if we have anything out of this, we're actually going to pay you back and you're going to share in the proceeds of it. So I agree with you. I think a lot of this is moving. I think the era is changing in terms of how people respect, the level of patient engagement within research and within development.
And I'll also add, we're going to see this stratification in use cases of real world data. There are some use cases where, like we're describing here, it's about, really it comes down to individual patients' data. We're looking at very specific patient populations. There are going to be other use cases that are really just at a population level, where we really are just studying 70 million lives worth of data at a time. And it would be burdensome and unrealistic for us to go out and call each of those patients and ask their permission. But that's where transparency is going to have to come into play. And that's where the front door, which is largely going to be the health systems where the patient's data was first being collected, are going to have to add a window in for patients to be able to see how their data was used. And as long as that data is being used for good purposes, then all of those stakeholders should be incredibly proud to be transparent, to be able to share and show you the audit trail that, Derek, your data today was used to help support research into prostate cancer going on in Helsinki. And you were able to do that while sitting on your couch eating Doritos. But I think it's going to challenge those same stakeholders to really have to rethink some of their use cases. If you're not proud to list publicly and transparently on a website how you used my health data, then you probably should be rethinking what you're doing with my health data. It's the same rules I give my teenagers when it comes to social media or going out with their friends. If you wouldn't want me to know about it, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And I think the same rules should apply to our health data.
It's the adaptation of the New York Times rule of public relations, right? If you don't want to see it on the front page of the New York Times, you shouldn't be doing it. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. Do you have any parting shots for the audience here before we wrap up?
I think the research community, both the folks at the bench and the provider side, but certainly in between, the clinical research community is rising up and trying to do everything that they can to ensure continuity of these new medicines for patients that are in need of them. I think this is going to be our window to instantiate that change. Derek, you're going to make it on CNN. This is going to be like one of those clips like that guy who was broadcasting from
To the back.
yeah, you know the one. Your wife's going to come scrambling in, grab the kids, and slide out. But what a great way to take a podcast out in the morning, with a dance number.
This is like the credits at the end of the thing. We can dance out with the credits. And in as much as I would like to display some exceptional parenting skills and anything here, I have nothing in my toolbox for this. So
embrace it. I say embrace it and bake it right in.
We can.
Maybe we should all go out with a dance. What do you say, Jennifer?
Yes.
Yeah, we can dance out. We can have jazz hands or whatever. Thank you, Dylan. High five. You created a very giftable moment.
We can TikTok our way out of this, out of the morning coffee.
If any one of our visitors can turn that into a GIF or other nicely shareable thing, I will send you a New York Bio coffee mug.
The challenge has been dropped.
Yeah,
but yeah, I would say, just like we're seeing in healthcare and elsewhere, for people to embrace this change, embrace this moment, to look for these silver linings and make sure that these aren't just deviations and waivers, but that we're really committing to the change, to make sure that patients are getting what they will increasingly expect on the other side. That's all. Thank you, Derek. Great way to take us out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been fantastic. You're a great first guest, and I hope we can live up to this bar in the future. For everybody, our Twitter handle is @NewYorkBio. You'll find more of this on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for participating in the first one of these that we've done. As Jennifer said before, we're going to do this every Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. So bring your cup of coffee. We have next week we have Irfan Khan from Circuit Clinical. And the following week, we have Stan Kachnowski, who's the executive director of HIT Labs. So we have some great stuff coming up.
It's a great lineup. I'm really psyched to keep logging in myself. That's awesome.
Yeah, we're going to make it well worth your cup of coffee on Tuesday mornings at 9 a.m. I'm excited. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, all. Have a good one.
Bye now.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.